The topic of this session will be process reforms as public policy. And the speaker of this event will be Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal, the Chancellor of the Gokhale Institute of Politics and Economics. Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal was a member of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister of India and played a key role in preparing 6 editions of the Economic Survey of India. To moderate this vital discussion, we are honored to welcome Mr. Bangaradka Vishweswara Bhat with his profound understanding of economics and the impact of policies on rural livelihood. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Bangaradka Vishweswara Bhat to the stage, who will introduce our esteemed speaker, Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal. Over to you, sir.
Good afternoon, namaste, and welcome to all of you. This session will be on the process reforms. Today, first I am going to start with the introduction of the main speaker of the program, Shri Sanjeev Sanyal. I have collected this detail from the Wikipedia, sir. If it is wrong, please excuse me. Sanjeev Sanyal is a very eminent economist and a historian also. He is a Rhodes Scholar also. In February 2017, he was appointed as the Principal Economic Advisor to the Indian Ministry of Finance. And in that capacity, he has drafted to prepare not one, but 6 Economic Survey of India reports. You know, Economic Survey report is something which is tabled in the Parliament the day before the actual budget is presented. In February 2022, he was appointed as the member of the Economic Advisory Council of Prime Minister in the rank of the Secretary to Government of India. Shri Sanyalji has also represented India at G7 and OECD meetings. Initially, when we were given to understand that Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal is going to address the gathering, I was under the impression that he was going to address about the strategic reforms that are taking place in this country since 2014. So actually, I had prepared some questions based on that only, like Vikasit Bharat, like GST and such other things. But only day before yesterday, I was told that Mr. Sanyalji is going to speak about the process reforms. So there is a small shift in the subject matter which I had presented in the Facebook about a week back, and what is going to happen today. Because earlier I had explained all those things in the Facebook interview also. Now, what is the difference between the structural reforms and the process reforms? The structural reforms are something which the government takes on a very broad macroeconomic parameters, like huge policy decisions. It could be like GST, it could be like formulas, it could be like IBC. So many such other things have happened in this government. But the process reform is entirely different. The process reform is something which happens when the government announces a big policy decision. The process will be there to implement that policy on the ground level. That will be generally on a very microeconomic parameters based on the issues. So naturally what happens is that when the process is implemented, there will be a lot of confusions in the ground level. Like for example, there will be bottlenecks, there will be red tapeism, there will be what you call policy paralysis and such other things. So Mr. Sanyalji is going to elaborate on these issues during this program. In the beginning, he has told me that he is going to present a PPT presentation here for probably 30 minutes, explain his thoughts on the PPT. Then we will have an interaction session. So repeatedly, I am telling you the same thing, sir. You are an economist, you are an historian, and above all, you are a bureaucrat, senior bureaucrat in the government. So today, you are going to wear the hat of the bureaucrat and explain the policy reform that are taking place in this government. Welcome to you, sir. Over to you.
Thank you very much. And how are you doing, Mangaluru? Are you doing well? Yes. Okay, good. So what I'm going to do today is to give you a flavor of what it is to be a policymaker. I'm not a bureaucrat, I'm a technocrat. The bureaucrats will be horrified to hear that. But what I'm going to do is give you a flavor of day-to-day policy making of a particular kind, which is very often not told to you or not given enough credence. But in fact, I take a great amount of time and pleasure and dedication to doing many of these kinds of reforms. So basically, the reason I want to tell you about this, because you see, recently you may have heard a lot about the fact that there are some major reforms happening in Argentina under President Milei. You may have heard that Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy are going to do Doge, Department of Government Efficiency in the US. So the fact is that we have actually been doing those kinds of reforms here for some years now. In fact, as you will see, I've been personally involved in many of them. So the question is, what is process reform and why do we care about it at all? You see, when we talk about reforms, usually you talk about structural reforms. You'll hear this term, structural reform. Now, what does structural reform mean? It basically means that you do some reform that changes the structure of whatever it is you're working on. So, for example, introducing GST is a change in the structure of our indirect tax system. Introducing insolvency and bankruptcy code is a change in the structure of creative destruction in the economy. Or even the original reforms we did in 1991, they changed the structure of our economy, right? If we had managed to get the farm laws through, that would have been a change in farming in the country. That's a structural reform. However, there is an entirely different class of reforms called process reforms. Now, these are basically nuts and bolts reforms. Some may think they're even boring reforms, but I hope to show you that they're not so boring and they're not unimportant. But they are the nuts and bolts that do not change the structure of the activity, but make it much, much more efficient. So these are the kinds of reforms I'm going to tell you about. Next. Now the problem is that when we talk about structural reforms, these are the nuts and bolts, so-and-so rule number, something, something small here, something small there. Very often what happens, people forget that this is what in your daily life gets in the way. Even with GST, the original change in the structure may have been a structural reform. But getting the small nuts and bolts, many of you complain about things relating to, for example, tax on popcorn. These are the kinds of issues that comes under process reforms, fixing these little things. And I will show you that, and many of you may even have experienced some of these. Now, the problem about process reforms is, and this is quite shocking, is how few academics actually write about it. You'll get the odd case study, but, I went through the net looking for literature on process reform, and I was shocked, not just India. Worldwide, there is almost no writing about it. For some reason, academics don't think they are very cool. But I have been writing about them and doing these reforms for recent years. The good news is that although there is very little on process reforms in government, there is a whole literature on business process reform. Now, you would think that, the government walas would have stolen this and begun to write about it, but they haven't. So, since there was no existing literature, I decided to look at the business process business process reorganization literature, and I discovered that there is a well-set system of doing it. So, I'm going to take you through them, then you will understand why. So, the first thing to do is obviously to identify a problem that exists in some process. It could be a law, it could be a department that should be shut down, it could be a regulation that is inefficient. Whatever it is, you identify a problem. Then you do the next thing that is important, very important. You then map out the process as it is today. Just map it out. Then what you will discover is that where the blockage in the system is. And now I've done so many reforms, I discovered that 90% of the problem is usually in 10% of the process. Anybody here who runs any large organization will know this. And then you fix that problem. After this, you have to do one more step, which is absolutely critical, is a feedback loop to see whether you manage to actually solve the problem. Very often, the people don't do this. But in fact, when you're dealing particularly with large systems, after you've made the change, not only may you discover that you've not solved the problem, you may discover that you have created new problems, unintended consequences of various kinds. So you have to do a feedback loop. Sometimes it doesn't work in 1 round, 2 rounds, 3 rounds. After a few iterations, it works. So this is what you have to do. Now, there are many such kinds of reforms. You can revisit default lists, precedents. You can streamline processes and regulations and legislation. Sometimes I have to go back to Parliament, sir, and we have to get you to change the laws. But very often you don't have to go to the Parliament back. You can change these because they are regulations, things. Sometimes you have to add some capacity in government. Sometimes you have to remove some capacity of government by shutting down outdated agencies. Any large system has large amounts of outdated things in it. You have to shut them down. So I'm going to give you one example from each one of them so you get a flavor of it. Next slide. So the first type of reform is simply to look at the kinds of default lists. In the government, there are default lists. Sometimes they are precedents. Sometimes they are list. It may be something simple. The list of people who are called as guests to the finance minister's consultation before budget. That list has been given on from ages. I used to be in finance minister when I was in the finance ministry. When I was given the list, I discovered that quite a few of those people were dead. But they're still there in the list. So, just like that, I'll give you one example of something that I have been working on, which is the list of national monuments. Now, we have some 3,000, how many? Let me see, 3,695 national monuments. And it turns out that almost all of them were inherited from the British period. Either they were in the list of the colonial government, British government, or they were in the princely states. We have added a handful of them since independence, since in the last 77 years, but most of our national monuments are national monuments already during the British period. As a result of which, it is full of bizarre national monuments. Many of them are graves of obscure colonial officials. Some PWD engineer who got killed in Nagaland. His grave, which is the size of this stage, is a national monument. All the rules that, 300 yards that you cannot develop, etc., all those rules apply to this monument. Nobody knows why he was killed. Nobody knows the name of the Naga warrior who killed him, who should in fact be probably the national hero. But like that, there are literally hundreds of them. Even worse, we actually do not even know where several dozens of these national monuments are. This is not today. There are questions from the 1970s in Parliament where Archaeological Survey has agreed that they do not know where several dozens of these national monuments are. Forget looking after, we don't know where they are. And yet, today, they are still in the list of national monuments. So some years ago, I decided to go through them and begin to clean them up. And so I discovered, first of all, we didn't know where many of them were. I discovered that there were many which shouldn't be on the list, because as I mentioned, there were, graves of obscure colonial officials. But let me tell you the story. Of one of them. So this relates to the statue of a British official, a British brigadier general called John Nicholson. John Nicholson was the brigadier in charge of the British forces when they retook Delhi in 1858 after the Great Rebellion. And he was, even by the standards of that time, considered to be extremely cruel. So he carried out a major massacre in Delhi, killed many people. But of course, he was a hero to the British. And so after he died, his grave, which is also near Kashmiri Gate in Delhi, and a statue which was raised to him near the Kashmiri Gate in the old city, both of them were turned into national monuments. Now, when we became independent, we inherited them. But we continued to consider it national monument. But even better, in the 1960s, his hometown in Northern Ireland asked for his statue to be sent there. So the Indian government of that time wrapped up his statue and sent it to Ireland, where in his village it still stands there, and every year there is some event to commemorate him. But the best part is, Archaeological Survey of India did not amend the list. So it was still remained in the list of national monuments. So here was a statue that didn't exist in India, but it was still a national monument. That spot where it used to stand continued to be protected, including the 300-meter radius around it, which cannot be developed. And you can imagine, Kashmiri Gate is an extremely crowded area. So every time anybody who lived in that area and wanted to do some small change in their house, they had to go and bribe the archaeological survey clerk of that, in charge of that area. So this continued till last July, when finally we delisted John Nicholson's statue, finally. So finally, as of July 2024, John Nicholson's statue has been delisted. This is his grave, which is still a national statue, a national monument. You can see there's still a blue board next to it, which threatens you with grave consequences if you do anything to that grave. Now, the reason I'm telling you this is that there are hundreds of such lists in the government that need to be updated. For example, the list of what is considered infrastructure. We do not have many things which should be, like ships are not considered infrastructure. So we need to keep updating these things. And so one type of process reforms is simply updating these kinds of things. And I have been doing this, as you can see, by simply going through default lists of the government. Next. Now I'm going to talk about administrative streamlining. Now this relates to a type of process reform where basically you don't change the rules, you don't change the regulation, you just change the process by which whatever activity is happening. So this relates to a reform that I was involved in, which is about voluntary liquidation of companies. So companies shut down because of insolvency, bankruptcy, etc. But most companies are shut down just because the people have simply got bored of running that company for whatever reason. Maybe they've become old, their kids don't want to run the company, it may be the subsidiary of a large company, they don't want to do that, whatever. 80% or more of companies around the world that shut down happen for voluntary reasons. Now, nobody's objecting to their shutting down. And still, let me show you how difficult it was. Have anybody here in this room ever tried to shut down a company? Yeah, there are a few people here. You would know, shutting down a company voluntarily in India used to be till very recently an extremely difficult activity. Many years would pass. Now, remember, this is voluntary. It's not because it's liquidating. Nobody is objecting to it. And yet, you had to go through either Section 248 of Companies Act 2013 or Section 58 of IBC. The first one is more widely used, so I'm going to talk about it. And you had to get an NOC from the tax department, from labor, from blah, blah, blah. And for some reason which nobody knows, you had to do it in a particular sequence. You couldn't do it in parallel. And then when you had got all the NOCs, then you had to go to the registrar of companies. And then the registrar of companies was supposed to put out an advertisement saying that this company is supposed to shut down. Fair enough. But it could take you years to get that advertisement out. I'm telling you this because this is not because anybody is objecting. It is just that they wouldn't put the up. So when I was researching this issue, I went and looked into it and discovered we actually had to pay off the registrar of companies some money to shut it down. In fact, I even got hold of a rate card. So now, having figured this out, I made a presentation to the Honorable Minister, Nirmala ji, who is also the Corporate Affairs Minister. This is in the year 2002, or was it 2001? And so we began to change the process. Next slide. So what we have now done, as of May 2023, we created a website called CPACE. And in that, what happens is that you can, if you want to shut down a company, you just load your details in. And the system immediately sends emails to messages to all the departments that are supposed to be giving you an NOC. And does it simultaneously. Next, if after 21 days nobody gets back, then the system itself generates an NOC and sends it to the registrar of companies. Now the registrar of companies now has a list. They can object to shutting them down, but then they have to give a reason. If they do not do that, then automatically advertisement comes out. And this entire process now, next slide, happens really quickly now. Let's show you what has happened as a result of this. It used to take, on average, 499 days to shut down a company in India, voluntarily in India. Now it takes only 90 days. This is the fastest in the world. It's faster than Singapore. And it can't be faster than this because you do need to have leads and lags in case there are some objections to it. So we are basically going to market it at 90, but this is the kind of change that you can have. Next. Now I'm going to talk to you about another kind of change, which is where the regulations have to be changed. So finally we actually have to change something. Now, this relates to something called the Revised Terms and Conditions Other Service Providers 2008. Sounds like some obscure thing. But let me tell you that this regulation, which was in place till 2021, effectively meant that any of you who were working from home were doing so illegally till 2021. Because this law basically stated that you had to specially get permission from the telecom ministry in order to do any work using a telecom system. So if you were doing any commercial work using a telecom system, that is work from home, and you had not got special permission under this regulation, you were actually violating the regulation. Now, the telecom officials were clever enough not to go and bother average citizens about it. But what they used to do, they used to go to all these IT, BPOs, IT-enabled services and all these kinds of companies and harass them. And as you can imagine, crores of rupees had to be paid to various officials in rent-seeking of various kinds in order to get past these regulations. And some of the regulations are absurd. For example, you were expected to have, if you were using telecom systems for commercial purposes, you were supposed to have an EPA BX machine in your basement at every location. So supposing you went to the cafe and were working from there, you were supposed to have an EPA BX machine at that location. You had to register it. There was restriction between doing business which was domestic and international. Now let me show you how absurd these things can get. Let's say I am Singapore Airlines, yeah? And I happen to have a BPO in India. Now, an Indian national buys a ticket in Singapore, flies to Mangaluru, let's say, has a problem with the ticket, and calls the line to solve it. Now, are you an international or are you a domestic? Point is, who knows? Who cares? This is a completely pointless distinction. And this is the kinds of distinctions that were there, and as you can imagine, a lot of bribery and rent-seeking used to happen as a result of this. Now, I discovered this completely by chance. You see, when the lockdown happened in March of 2020, the telecom department came out with a notification. It said that we are holding this OSP regulation in abeyance till December 2020 in order to allow people to work from home. Now, I'm a suspicious sort of chap. Moment I read it, I realized what it really meant was the telecom ministry was telling the companies that, we are letting you work right now, but do remember, this law may be absurd, but it applies. That's what they were really signaling. So I began to work on it. Next slide. So, in 2 rounds, first in November 2020 and then another round in 2021, these laws were completely repealed. Now, there are still some rules, but by and large, they do not really matter anymore. These OSP regulations are gone. Now, anybody here who runs a BPO IT-enabled service will, before this thing was removed, will know how big a deal it is. So let me show you. Next slide. A survey was done in December 2021 by NASSCOM asking people how many people benefited from the removal of this OSP. And they said 92% of BPO and IT enabled services saw their compliance burden go down. 92%. 28% of them said it went down 50%. So can you imagine the efficiency gains from doing this reform? And yet, most people in this country will not even know that this rule exists, even though IT and IT-enabled services are such a big deal in this country. And yet, this kind of absurd rules were still around till very recently. Next. Now I'm going to tell you about something called the Legal Metrology Act. This is still in process, but let me see how many of you even know what legal metrology is. Okay, there are two or three people here who know what weight this is. This relates to weights, measures. Also, I'm additionally adding here labels. Now, every country in the world has weights, measures, labels, laws. Nothing wrong with that. You need them. Except in India, the laws are set up in such a way that on the first instance, if you do something wrong, you're given a small fine. But on the second instance, you can be sent to jail for 7 years. Okay? So now imagine what happens, and I've given the data here. Effectively, every year, about 1 lakh such cases are found on legal metrology on the first instance. Okay? But on the second instance, you get only 3, 5, 11. Now, the legal metrology people claim that this is a great victory. Look, once you have given them a fine, nobody ever dares to do anything wrong again. But in fact, that is not the case. Basically, what is happening, let's say I am a small manufacturer, I do some label or something, some small change, and I make there some error. And some of the errors may be completely trivial. You know, the spelling of gram is G and not GM or some silly thing like that. They will then fine you 2,000 rupees. You'll say, oh yeah, 2,000 rupees here, get on with it, change the label. But now, you are the slave of the system forever. The next time some small error is found, you can be sent to jail for 7 years. So get what happens. Large parts of the system effectively have to pay hafta to keep themselves out of jail. So, next slide. So, as a part of Jan Vishwas bill, we did manage to remove some of these, of the worst clauses. But sections 30, 33 and 36 that account for 80% of the cases are still on the, and I am working very hard to get rid of them. Thank you, I need the support. Because officials in charge of legal metrology are not happy about my attempting to change this. But anyway, but you can see the kinds of things that go on. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to tell you about all this while I was trying to reduce state capacity. I will tell you about an area where you actually need to increase state capacity. This is type 5. Now, you all know the property rights is important. Yeah, in the modern knowledge economy, everybody agrees property rights, we need to do well. One of the key things you need to do in property rights is patents, right? Now, as recently as 2016, right, that's 7-8 years ago, India used to not even do 10,000 patents a year. For a country our size, that's an absurdly small number of patents. In comparison, at that time, already US was doing 3 lakh patents a year, China was doing 4 lakh patents a year, and look at where the numbers have gone up. US is now doing 3 lakh 15,000 patents a year, China is now doing 9 lakh patents a year. Now, many of those patents are not very high quality, so that number is exaggerated, but nevertheless, I think it's reasonable to say they are doing at least 2-3 lakh patents a year that are of decent quality. Now, when you're playing in this game, clearly, you have to do something about it. One is the process itself had to be changed, and we have made some changes. Next slide. But the real problem which I discovered when I was going through this was that we just didn't have enough people. So, we basically had very, very few people working in this sector. So, China had some 13,500 people working in the patent office. America has 8,500 people in our patent office. We till very recently had only 400. Now, how on earth do you expect our guys, even if they are very efficient, to be able to perform? So basically what was happening is, there are two levels in patents. One is examiner level, one is the disposal controller level. Anytime we sped up one, the other one just piled up. But there's just not enough of these people. So in the last 1 year, we have just doubled the number of patent officers. So we hired 500 more people. They are just now being deployed. They've gone through their training. They are now being deployed. We have now beginning to already think of hiring more. And as a result of this, in the last financial year, we did 103,000 patents. That's a 10 times increase in the number of patents processed in a 7-year period. And now we have a new problem, which is the number of applications that are coming in. If you go back to the previous slide, I will show you. The number of applications right at the bottom, up to we were doing. So look at 2023-24. So that one, we have full data. The 24 number is still not updated. It's not completed, obviously. We have a problem that the number of patents we are now pushing out is larger than the number of applications. So the old backlog has been cleared, and we are not getting enough. So any of you are inventors, etc., please come to us. The patent system is waiting for you. We need this process. We are willing to process you really fast. The amount of time taken to process patents in India, which used to run into 5-6 years, is now come down dramatically. We are doing it within 2.5-3 years, which is as good as any in the world. So this is another major reform done. Next. Those of you who run companies know that one of the major one problem that we have created for ourselves in India recently is the problem of mandatory mediation. Now, mediation in itself is not a problem. So let me explain what mediation is in case you don't know. It's basically a pre-litigation process. So in case supposing I and he have a problem, instead of taking it directly to court, we go to a mediator and some sort of a reconciliation happen. Nothing wrong with that. I am in favor of this. So, But what happened is that in 2015, we introduced a law which made it mandatory for all commercial disputes. Now what happens, you can imagine, the moment you make something mandatory, the people who are supposed to provide that service have no reason to basically give you a good service. So naturally what happens now is that all the cases have to go to through the process, but our experience is that mediation leads to no great outcomes. So in order to look into this, we actually did a survey of the number of, went to the courts, commercial courts, to look at how many of these cases were getting resolved. And you can see that 97 to 99% of the cases go through mediation and don't come to any positive outcome. So the point is, why are we bothering to do this? If all that happens is that the companies have to pay the mediator for 6 months, the whole process is delayed, lawyers have to be paid, and in the end, 97-98% of these will end back in the courts. 6 months have been wasted. So I am in favor of getting rid of this as a mandate process in order to. So this is a reform where I'm actually removing something which we only had introduced and removing it out. So that's why I keep telling you, feedback loops is absolutely critical. Next, this is the last type of reform. So we are now working towards removing this compulsory and making it voluntary. So that's basically the point. Now this is the last category, which is restructuring outdated government or closing and merging outdated government agencies. Now, there are a whole bunch of, in any large system, there will be agencies, bodies, etc., which at some point may have had some use, but has now run out of use. You have to keep shutting them down. This is a natural thing that you need to do. This will be even true of even a large university. It will be true of large companies. It's certainly true of Indian government. The Indian government has 840 odd autonomous bodies. Okay, these are not ministries and departments, autonomous bodies. Now, some of these have some use, but there are literally dozens of them which have outlived their utility, and we need to shut them down. Now, the point is, somebody has to go and do this. This is what Elon Musk is also saying he's going to do. But we have been shutting many of these down in the last several years. In the last few years, here are a bunch that I have been involved in. There is the Tariff Commission, the All India Handloom Board, the All India Handicraft Board, the Central Organization for Modernization of Workshops, the Rashtriya Mahila Kosh. There are several more. I can keep Children's Film Society, etc. These have been shut now for several years. Has any of your lives become worse? No? But unfortunately, it's not easy to do, because very often they become sinecures, places for retired civil servants to hang out after they retire. Very often there's some incumbent who is taking advantage of it. So they will fight you tooth and nail when you shut it down, even though there is no known use for them. So I'll give you one example. There was the All India Handicraft Board. Okay, now be very clear, I love handicrafts, I have no problem with promoting them. But the question is, when there are so many other handicraft related agencies, both at national and at state level, do you also need an All India Handicraft Board? So we shut it down. Now there was a lady who was running it for many, many years, who was heading it. She then got very annoyed that this thing was being shut down. So she wrote in one of the, I think it was the Mumbai newspapers, saying how this government is fascist, it doesn't love artisans, etc. Why is it shutting this down? So the minister in charge, she was Smriti Irani ji, she was Minister of Textiles where this thing came under her. When this was brought to her, she tweeted that, Madam, if you can provide minutes of any meeting that has happened in the All India Handicraft Board in the last 16 years, then we will reopen it. I'm still waiting for those minutes. So there are literally hundreds of these kinds of organizations, departments, etc. inside, and you know, there are many such that need to be also relooked at. For example, we have, you'll be surprised, there is actually a UPSC service called the All India Salt Service. Did you even know this? Yes. It is the oldest service of the government of India, started by the East India Company in the 1800s. It still exists. And there are many such. I mean, I can keep going. I can have one full session just on the list of these strange services that exist. And so how on earth do I know if they even exist? Well, because when the budget comes out, everybody looks at budget at a glance. Those like 10 pages. Please bother to look at that thick potha. And when you go inside them, go by ministry, underneath them you will find all these, okay, obscure departments. You will find, you know, there is some, right in Mangalore, there may be some national institute driving, you know, they've got nice 10-acre campus with a, you know, and nobody knows what goes on inside it. So these kinds of bodies need to be looked at. Now, some of them may have some use, some of them may need revival, but a lot of them need to be simply shut down. And we have to do this. With that, let me come to an end with the last slide. Basically, the point I'm going to make here is every large system needs periodic cleaning up. We have to be willing to do this. The American government, the incoming Trump administration, is going to create a big effort called DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency under Musk and Vivek. And they're going to do this. There is a major cleaning up going out in Argentina. But I just wanted to give you a flavor of the fact that here in India, we have been now doing it for several years and with very, very good effects. Thank you very much.
Sir, process reforms is something which we have never heard of here. This was never a part of the syllabus also in the colleges, even up to the post-graduation level. How far it has evolved in the developed countries, and in Indian context, how critical it is in making India a Vikasit Bharat?
This is absolutely critical because you see, in many people's mind, the idea is that big changes require, big sort of improvements require big reforms. But the point I am trying to show here is, in fact, much of what gets in most of your lives, it may be personal lives, business, etc., are not big things. They're mostly small things that get in the way. I mean, you can't improve your house because there is supposedly a national monument 300 meters, 200 meters away, which in fact shouldn't even be a national monument. And yet your own life is influenced. You cannot upgrade your house, or you have to go and bribe the archaeological survey clerk. I mean, these are the kinds of absurd things we have. So I am a big believer in small reforms. Yes, occasionally you need big reforms, but much of what you need to do to improve your life is small reforms. Some rule number 43C, subsection D, something will be there, which will get in your life. We need to pay attention, systematically change them. Now, doing this requires, one, paying attention, two, having the political clout to carry it through. Because remember, each one of those is there because somebody actually takes advantage of it. Sometimes it's there because nobody was paying attention. But a lot of them are there because somebody actually is benefiting from it. Even if there is a wider, getting rid of them will benefit many people, but a small group of people who benefit directly from it will hold on to it and perpetuate it. So a willingness on the political leadership, which I have had the backing of, to do these reforms. I mean, without Prime Minister Modi's backing, I would not be able to make any of those changes. I mean, nobody is making those changes. I'm not making those changes because, suddenly people are saying, yeah, this is a great idea and do it. I'm able to do it because I have the backing to do them.
There were many strategic reforms taken up by this government since 2014. Like, for example, Skill India, Startup India, Make in India, or probably GST also. Many of them have not really taken off properly. Do you think that is it because of the lack of process reform that have been there in the
So
country?
This is an important point. You see, just because you've done a structural reform does not mean that it will work in the first route. You need to continuously adjust it along the way through through these process reforms. So introduce a big change, but then you will, after introducing it, discover many small glitches by definition. So fixing those are absolutely critical. Now, those of you who do software know what I'm talking about. It's called agile. Nothing genius about this. This thinking already exists in many other areas. For some reason in government, this does not happen. Or when you do it, people think, oh my God, there's something bad about this. No. You have to be willing to allow continuous small changes to be done. And some of them will go wrong also. Then you may have to backtrack. That's okay. Point is, you need to allow continuous process reforms to happen. So, for example, let's take GST. GST as a structural reform is a massively good thing because in case you think there are problems with today's system, the earlier system was much, much worse.
It was worse, I agree.
So let me explain, just a sec. But does not mean that the system we have today is perfect. So we have to continuously adjust small things along the way. Now the critical thing here is that we need to make sure that whatever the changes we do lead ultimately to simplification. Otherwise, you see, we will end up with the popcorn problem.
Sir, but do you feel that the GST was brought little too early without proper preparation?
No, I actually have the opposite view.
Because since 1996, the GST was on the minds of all the governments. Nobody dared to take it up, including Atal Bihari Vajpayee government. Our
Not
government took it up,
1996.
but do you think that our software and our preparation was not enough during that time? Because at that time, all the economists, I don't know whether you are of the same opinion, were feeling that the GST, the introduction of GST will result in a fall of 1% of the GDP for the first year. But it continued for 3 years.
So let me tell you that we needed to have some kind of unified GST-like system for a very long time.
Yes.
This was true when I was in college in the early 90s also, because in case you have problem with GST, do remember that the previous system of state taxes, octroi, etc., what used to happen, lines of trucks used to be stuck in front of each state border. It was actually easier for Mumbai to trade with Shanghai than for Mumbai to trade with Delhi. So, in a sense, GST was needed because we needed to create a unified common market. GST is a free trade agreement India signed with itself. Okay? Now the question is, was the introduction hurried? Now let me tell you, no matter when we introduced it, it was going to be a problem. So, if we were trying to create a perfect system and then introduce it, then let me tell you, we would be having this debate even today. So the only way a GST-like system can be introduced is to more or less make the contours of the system, introduce it, and then fix it, which is what we did. Now, as a result of which, we managed to create a system. By the way, you see GST was introduced in many countries. In every single case, it caused all kinds of disruption. Now, you're saying for 3 years it caused slowdown. No, I wouldn't say that, because do remember that it was introduced in 98, or 97 or 98, and then we ended up at COVID. So those years shouldn't be counted.
2017, I remember.
Yeah, so in 1920, so there was some squeeze on that, I agree. But I would argue that by and large it got reasonably smoothly set up. So if we had not introduced it and fixed it afterwards...
Sir, I would put it differently.
Okay.
We were clocking about plus 7% growth in the GDP up to 2016, I think. All of a sudden in 2017, our GDP growth fell below, for the first time, below 7%. We thought it was an accident or temporary.
No, there were several things.
One minute. But that was repeated in the 2018 also. It was also 6.4 or something percentage. Then everybody got scared of that. When we were expecting something better to happen, 2019, India's GDP growth was, if I remember correct and according to the MOSPER, the Ministry of Statistics, it was 3.9%.
So
2018.
So there was undoubtedly...
Not sir. Do you think GST was in a way responsible for all this?
So there were several things that happened simultaneously, all of which are contractionary things but are good things. First of all, we introduced GST, that's true. We began to clean up the banks. Remember that. Cleaning up of banks is an extremely painful contractionary activity. We've also introduced GST. We did demonetization. The global economic growth in those years was also lower. So in a sense, people can argue that, we did too many things together, but it is true that all of these things are major reforms. The cleaning of the banks is not a trivial thing. Since I am the person who was in charge, I was not the person who introduced GST, but the cleaning of the banks was something I personally did. And let me tell you, and you have many banks here, very painful thing. So what did I have to do? One thing was we could keep creating a bad bank, put all the companies in the bad bank, like BIFR of the old days, it would all fester around for the next decade. All of the taxpayers would be paying to get it down. Instead, we used the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code and bankrupted some very large companies. Remember that? Yeah, 12 very large companies we bankrupted. Remember that? They're called the Dirty Dozen. That's the name I gave them. And after that, what happened? It dramatically improved creditor culture in the country. Cash began to come into the banks. As a result, despite COVID, we ended up with a banking system which is today among the best capitalized and most efficient in the world. But at the time that I was cleaning it up, what happened? I was liquidating large companies. That is contractionary. So growth will get affected. If I suddenly, you begin to liquidate large number of companies, it will be, in the long run, it's a good thing because you have liquidated bad companies, the banks have got back their money, new owners have taken over those assets and are doing things. But at the point that you're liquidating them, growth is affected. So the same thing, at the same time we were introducing the GST. Of course it's disruptive. Was it disruptive? Absolutely. But at some point in our history, we had to be willing to do it. So at the result of this, we have now got a good banking system. We have a GST, which is not perfect. I am not making the case that it's a perfect system, But let me tell you, it is a good enough system that 30 years from now, we will probably, hopefully, have gotten rid of all the glitches, will be working efficiently. But 30 years from now, the rough contours of the system that we have created will still be functioning.
Sir, let me come to the Vikasit Bharat 2047 target of Government of India. As I have told you, since 2019, forget about the COVID year, we have never clocked a good GDP growth, except 1 year in 2023-22 post-COVID, because the benchmark was very low. The World Bank has already observed that India is sort of caught in a middle-income trap to become a developed country. Now, what is developed country? Developed country is something, as far as I know, is a country where the per capita income is $13,750. What is a poor country? Poor country is something which has the per capita income of less than $1,750. With all the bravado and everything we are speaking about, we are only at $2,350.
No longer. We are almost at 3,000, but that's a different
around 3,000 now. 2,350 according to the MOSPI in the 2023. Probably this year it could be 3,000. But it is very far off from...
No doubt. But
the question is, with a growth rate of around 7%, is it possible for India to scale the height of 13,750 in 21 years?
Yes. So let me tell you why. First of all, do remember where we have come from.
Sir, 1 minute. The simple mathematics says that with a 7% growth, it will take 13 years to double the GDP.
First of all, you have the wrong maths. I'll tell you why. Because this is a nominal number, not a real number. When you're talking about 7% real growth, you have to add inflation. It's a dollar number. So you have to allow for the inflation, US inflation, or you have to take our inflation minus depreciation, whichever one you prefer. But basically, you are looking at a 10 percentage point compounding. So it's dramatically fast, speeds up. So first of all, that is an important thing.
Yes, we are optimistic.
Yeah. So point is, 25 years. Just so that you get a sense of this. Back in the year 1991, when we began to do these reforms, that's about 30 years ago, our per capita income was not even $300. Okay. So we have done a 10 times increase in 30 years without even those high growth rates. Because during that entire period, we had the slowdown from 1991, we had the slowdown from various other slowdowns along the way. So despite that, we have done a 10 times increase in our per capita income in this 30 years. We have now 24 odd years to do that change. My own sense is that we can dramatically increase our per capita income. Even China's per capita income has slowed down. Slowed down. Even in its height, it was only a few years when it did 10 in real terms. So my own sense is that we don't need to do every year 10 years. Very important that we keep somewhere around 7 during the difficult periods. Right now is a particularly difficult period in global growth. But there will be phases where we will get the road clear, where we'll be able to do 10%. But very important, and this is where economics is important to understand, do not attempt to grow at 10% when world growth is not allowing you to do this. It is very, very tempting for rhetoric, say, we should be aiming to do 10%. Well, yes, if we attempted to do 10% today, right now, you know what would happen? The rate at which we are importing would go up so fast that our exports would just not be able to keep up because the rest of the world is not growing. So what would happen? We'll get 2 years of good growth and then a crisis. Now, if you want to know what that looks like, go back to the 90s. All these countries of Southeast Asia were at that time considered the high growth countries of the time. They grew for a few years, very high growth rate. Their exports grew very fast as well, but their imports grew even faster. And at the end, it blew up. So the important thing I want to tell is that maintaining macroeconomic stability through this period, especially when you have great amount of uncertainty in the world is very, very important, because that allows you to stay alive for the good times. Right now, we are managing growth somewhere close to 7%. This year, maybe a little slower at 6.4, but this is still decent. We need to grow at around 7. I would prefer the growth rates go back to somewhere in the 7 range. 7% growth rate is equivalent to about 11% nominal GDP growth rate.
But 7% is minus inflation, sir.
Yeah, that's of course. So that's why,
Yes.
but the number you're giving of per capita income is a
Minus-
nominal number. It's
Yes,
not a real number.
Yes.
If you're talking in terms of purchasing power parity, our per capita
That is
income is
better.
11,000. So purchasing power wise, it is much higher already. But anyway, point I'm making is maintaining discipline during periods where there is uncertainty in the rest of the world is an important part of economic policy making. This is what means that we accumulate foreign exchange reserves, we allow the rupee to adjust smoothly without too much volatility, and also make sure that there are no overheating in the foreign exchange markets, overheating in our banking system, overheating in our stock market. So, for example, when the stock market became too exuberant, you have to be willing to increase taxes to lower it. None of this makes you popular. None of this makes you popular. But you have to be willing to do it, because only then will your economy will be alive for the good times, and they will come. The good times too will come. I cannot predict when it will come, but the world economy goes through cycles. So some point, just like China got 6-7 years of really high growth in the 2000s, when we also grew quite well, but they grew really fast, we will also get 6-7 years at some point. At that point, press the accelerator. But do not attempt to press the accelerator at any and every time. Just like driving a car, when the road is bad, you have to handle it with care.
Sir, one short pointed question to you only, then we will ask the audience to ask the question.
Yeah.
Somebody contacted you earlier to speak on this LitFest program, and they gave you a subject, welfare economics. And you told us that I am not a liberalist, so I will speak about the process reforms. My pointed question is just why? One minute. Or to put it in a different way, is it possible for somebody to become a good policy maker without really being a liberalist?
Absolutely. I have always been of the Kautilya school of economics, not of the Ashoka school of economics. So, if you read Kautilya believes in maintaining, providing, what is the role of the state in the Kautilyan state? The role of the state is to do the following things. 1, internal security. 2, external security. 3, provide defense, provide infrastructure, maintain money supply, make sure there are business practices and are regulated. These are the kinds of things that the Kautilyan state does. Ashoka added all kinds of other activities in the name of welfare. In fact, Ashoka is the inventor of the Mai Baap Sarkar, because he talks about, in his edicts, he talks about how he hands over his subjects to Rajukas and the Dharma Mahamantas. So he was advocating, but what did Ashoka achieve through it? Kautilya built, along with Chandragupta Maurya, he built the Mauryan Empire. Ashoka's empire collapsed while he was still alive. So be very, very afraid of all this welfareism. Ultimately, either the state will collapse or you will get taxes on your toilets, as Himachal is currently doing. This is absolutely critical to remember. Yes, the state does have a role in terms of providing safety nets. So, yes, some transfers to the very poor. Yes, help during national calamities. But introducing all kinds of giveaways is a very bad idea, Because, as everybody should know, there are no free lunches. Every free lunch is paid for by somebody. And there are no non-tax players. Even if you are not paying income tax, you're paying GST, you're paying all kinds of other fees and charges. Ultimately, at worst, you'll be paying inflation, which is also a tax. So be clear that somebody pays for it, and it's you. So when a politician says that I am going to give XYZ amount of money to so-and-so cause, they are actually saying, I'm going to make you pay for that.
Yes.
So therefore, when you said you want to do a full session on this, I said I'm very welcome to answer one question on the topic and make it clear why I am against this Revadi culture in politics.
Yes.
Sir, thank you. Any question from the audience?
No, since
Welcome.
we are out of time, so we'll
Out
not
of
be
time?
having the audience queries. So thank you, Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal, for your enlightening presentation, and thank you, Mr. Bangaradka, Vishweswara Bhat, for moderating this insightful session. I request Mr. Sai Sharan to give away the mementos to our panelists here on the stage. Mr. Sai Sharan from the Mangalore Lit Fest team to give away the mementos to Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal and Mr. Bangaradka Vishweswara Bhat. Thank you so much.